Welcome, this is Ava. I have been talking to Cricket about her new book, When Life Changed, I Fought Back. Today, we're going back to the moment where the ground shifts the diagnosis. Up until that point, Cricket was doing everything by the book, eating right, exercising, and never missing a screening. She thought that preventative maintenance was a guarantee of safety, but she learned quickly that cancer can be a silent thief that doesn't play by the rules. In this episode, we're exploring that brutal division of time, the person you were before those 3 words were spoken, and the person you're forced to become the second after. We'll talk about the choice between passive compliance and choosing friction, and why Cricket decided to start swinging a machete to clear her own path. This is part 1. When Life Changed, I Fought Back. Here is Dean and Diana.
Imagine going to the doctor for a routine checkup. Like you eat right, you exercise, you've never missed a screening in your life.
Right, you're doing everything by the book.
Exactly. You're sitting on that crinkly paper feeling completely fine, maybe, mentally running through your grocery list for the day. But when the doctor walks back into the room, their posture has it's changed.
Oh yeah, that shift in the energy.
Yeah, they avoid eye contact for just a fraction of a second too long. And in 3 short words, that whole illusion that doing everything right keeps you safe, it just shatters completely.
You have cancer.
It forces an immediate, brutal division of your timeline. There's the person you were before that sentence was spoken, and the person you are literally forced to become the second after. Because everything you thought was a certainty is suddenly just a variable.
And that is the exact pivot point we're diving into today. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at this really remarkable upcoming book releasing in July of 2026. It's called When Life Changed and I Fought Back by Cricket Fox. Yeah, some of you listening might actually know her from her show, Corner Coffee with Cricket.
Right. And today, our mission is really to extract the blueprint she built for navigating medical trauma. And more importantly, how she learned to advocate for herself when the whole medical system just threatened to swallow her whole.
I mean, to even understand that blueprint, we have to acknowledge the foundation it was built on. Her husband, Phil, is really the anchor of this entire 3-year cancer journey. But there is this incredibly heavy reality shared right in the author's note.
Yeah, that part really got me.
It's heartbreaking. Phil passed away after the pages of this book were written, so he isn't here to see this blueprint published, but his quiet, constant presence, it really informs the entire philosophy of her survival.
It totally recontextualizes everything you read. She's moving forward alone, carrying these lessons they forged together. And I really want to frame our conversation today, not just as a retrospective on some medical battle.
Right, it's bigger than that.
It is. This is really a field manual for what to do when life suddenly forces you off the highway and deep into the wilderness.
Ooh.
So let's look at how she ended up there. She had been dealing with what she assumed were just standard postmenopausal symptoms.
Like hot flashes, right?
Yeah, just hot flashes. She goes in for a routine pap smear, and shortly after, further testing reveals endometrial cancer, stage 1.
Yeah, active cancer cells in the lining of her uterus. And the way she describes this specific type of cancer is haunting. She calls it a silent thief.
A silent thief, wow.
And if we look at the mechanics of why that term is so resonant, it basically comes down to a violation of causality.
Like a betrayal.
Because she held up her end of the bargain.
She did. We're all conditioned to believe that if we follow the preventative maintenance schedule, getting the checkups, eating the vegetables, doing the cardio,
right,
we think our bodies will warn us if the engine light comes on. But endometrial cancer didn't trigger any early warning sensors for her. The thief just bypassed the alarm system entirely, which is terrifying. Because when you're faced with a threat that doesn't play by the rules, your instinct is usually panic. But Cricket boils the immediate aftermath of a diagnosis down to this really stark fork in the road. She says you have choice A or choice B. Let's actually look at choice B first because, frankly, it seems like the default setting for most of the healthcare system.
It really is. So choice B is passive compliance. You just lay back, you give up your autonomy, and you let the sheer gravity of the medical bureaucracy pull you along.
You're just a passenger.
Exactly. You don't ask what the medications do. You don't question the timeline. You just become a passenger in your own treatment. And the system prefers this because it's efficient. Frictionless patients are just easier to process.
Which brings us to choice A, choosing friction, becoming actively knowledgeable, challenging assumptions, and essentially fighting for a seat at the table where decisions about your own survival are made. But I had to push back on this a little bit because I kept thinking about this while reading.
Sure, what did you think?
Well, it sounds incredibly empowering on paper, right? But if my body is actively failing and I am terrified, telling me I need to take on a part-time job as a medical researcher just to survive, I mean, that feels almost cruel. It's like being in a skidding car. Choice B is just closing your eyes and hoping for the best, while choice A is trying to grab the steering wheel and pump the brakes when you've never even taken a defensive driving course. Isn't choice A just incredibly exhausting when you can barely process the diagnosis?
Oh, absolutely. That is the fundamental paradox of self-advocacy. It requires energy you feel like you just do not have. But Cricket makes this fascinating psychological distinction here. She realized that the exhaustion of passively waiting in the dark for someone else to save her was actually more draining than the exhaustion of fighting.
Huh. That's an interesting way to look at it.
Right. She describes the whole medical landscape as this forest of questions. If you choose choice B, you are just sitting in the middle of those dark woods, hoping a rescue party finds you. Choice A is exhausting, yes, because you are literally swinging a machete to clear your own path, but it generates forward momentum.
Right. But to clear a path, you usually need some kind of reference point. You need a map.
Huh.
And this is a detail that completely stopped me in my tracks while reading. Cricket couldn't look backward to figure out her path forward because she was adopted.
Yeah, a literal blank slate in terms of genetics. We take for granted how often doctors rely on familial health histories to predict risks or, determine treatment aggressiveness.
Like, did your mom have this? Did your grandma?
Exactly. And Cricket had zero historical data, no idea if her biological mother or grandmother faced anything like this.
And it wasn't just about her. Both of her daughters had faced their own health issues involving cancer. So she realized in real time that her fight wasn't just about surviving the year. She was acting as the cartographer for her descendants.
She was writing the medical history book from scratch.
Yeah, so her daughters wouldn't have to wander blindly in that same forest.
The stakes go from individual survival to generational protection. And because the stakes are that high, she developed these very specific tactical methods for engaging with the medical machine. And the most crucial one she introduces is finding an outside voice.
Okay, let's dig into how that actually works, because if you're listening right now and thinking about who you would call in a crisis, your first instinct is probably your spouse, your parent, or your best friend.
Naturally, yeah.
But Cricket suggests that those are often the worst people to rely on for objective clarity.
Because they are right in the blast radius of the diagnosis with you. When doctors start throwing around complex terminology, staging numbers, and mortality rates, a patient's brain typically enters a state of complete cognitive overload.
Right, you're just not absorbing anything.
No, you can't. The fight or flight response physically impedes the prefrontal cortex from processing complex information, and your partner sitting next to you. They are likely in the exact same state of neurological panic.
So an outside voice has to be someone who is detached from the emotional whirlpool. Like, she leaned on professionals, counselors, nurses, people who could look at a terrifying chart and translate it into a structured checklist without their own heart rate spiking.
They act as a filter. They remove the emotional resonance from the data so you can actually figure out what the immediate next step is rather than just spiraling into worst-case scenarios.
And she also found an informal version of this in waiting rooms, right? Just striking up conversations with other patients. They might casually mention how they handled a specific side effect of a medication that the doctor never even brought up. It's like peer-to-peer mapping.
Oh, there is a whole underground economy of knowledge among patients. The doctors know the clinical trials and the statistics, sure, but the person sitting next to you in the waiting room knows how to physically get through the Tuesday after a treatment.
Yeah. And when it comes to the doctors themselves, she had a strict rule about plain language. If a specialist used a term she didn't grasp, she stopped the appointment and made them explain it. She draws a line here that I think is maybe the most valuable takeaway from the entire book: the difference between being medically trained and medically knowledgeable.
It's a vital distinction. The medical system often inadvertently makes patients feel ignorant because they don't have a medical degree. But Cricket argues you don't need to be trained to be knowledgeable.
It's like hiring an architect to build you a house, right? You don't need to know how to pour the concrete foundation, and you don't need to know how to wire the electrical panel that's being trained. But you absolutely must know how to read the blueprints well enough to know if they are building a house you can actually live in. That's being knowledgeable.
That's a great analogy. And if the architect refuses to explain the blueprint in a way you understand, you don't just blindly sign off on the house, you force them to explain it. That is choice A in action.
Right. But, I mean, theory is great.
Hmm.
Putting that into practice when your body is actively betraying you is another story. And her CT scan is really where the theory hits a wall of physiological panic.
Yeah, that transition from the conceptual fight to the sterile, terrifying reality of a hospital procedure.
She actually had to delay the initial scan because just speaking to the hospital scheduling department triggered a severe panic attack. And when she finally goes in on June 22nd, the visceral details she shares are intense. She says the machine is incredibly loud. She compares it to being trapped inside a metal dryer.
Which sounds awful.
Truly. And to cope, Phil is there with her. She wears earphones. She counts. She hums. She even physically covers her eyes with her right arm just to block out the sterile environment.
Those sensory details really matter because they illustrate how much energy it takes just to remain physically present in the room. The clinical environment is inherently hostile to human comfort.
But she gets through it. She walks back out to Phil in the waiting area and just says, "I did IT." It's this momentary triumph. And by July 1st, the scan results are initially great. The cancer is localized. They schedule a full hysterectomy for July 20th to just remove the thread entirely.
But then there's a setback.
Right. A few weeks before the surgery, July 13th, she goes in for a mini physical with a high-risk team. They do an ECG, a memory test, and a 6-minute walk test. And she barely makes it 3 minutes before she has to stop. Her blood pressure is just off the charts.
She is officially experiencing white coat hypertension. Her cardiovascular system is reacting to the clinical environment as if she is being hunted by a predator. Her blood pressure spikes purely from the psychological weight of being in the hospital.
And because of this, Dr. Gibb calls her on July 15th and completely halts the schedule. They delay the cancer surgery by more than a month to August 24th just to manage her blood pressure. Wait, I really need to pause here.
Yeah.
She has active cancer cells in her uterus. Why on earth would a doctor halt a life-saving cancer surgery just because she got nervous and her blood pressure spiked in a clinic?
Yeah.
Isn't the cancer the primary ticking clock? Like, if you're training for a marathon and you show up at the starting line, they don't tell you to go home and wait another month because you have pre-raised jitters.
Well, it seems entirely counterintuitive until you examine the actual physiological mechanics of general anesthesia.
Okay.
When you are put under for a major procedure like a full hysterectomy, the anesthesia chemically suppresses your cardiovascular and respiratory systems. If a patient enters that state with a severely elevated heart rate and dangerously high blood pressure due to extreme panic, the physiological whiplash can be fatal.
Wow.
Yeah. Forcing her body into surgical trauma while she is in a state of high alert hypertension significantly increases the risk of stroke or cardiac arrest right there on the table. So the doctors aren't ignoring the cancer, they are preventing the cure from killing her.
Okay, that makes sense medically. But psychologically, it's got to be devastating. You spend weeks building up the adrenaline and mental fortitude to cross a finish line, and you're told to go sit at home with the cancer for 4 more weeks.
Most people would just spiral into despair. But this is where her choice A philosophy solidifies from just an idea into a tangible survival mechanism. She stops viewing the high-risk team as adversaries putting up hurdles and starts viewing them as builders, making sure her foundation can actually withstand an earthquake. She reframes that agonizing 4-week delay as a training camp.
A training camp for her mind and body. I love that. She spends the month actively lowering her blood pressure, fighting off a minor infection she had, and seeking out these tiny victories. And there's a moment during that high-risk assessment that feels almost like a screenwriter put it there. She walks past a doctor's office, and the nameplate on the door literally says, Dr. P. Disney.
I love that part. The brain is a pattern recognition machine, and when you are immersed in an environment characterized by terms like malignant, high risk, and mortality, spotting the word Disney functions as a psychological circuit breaker. It reminded her that a narrative with a happy ending was still a statistical possibility.
So she utilizes the training camp. She gets her baseline stable.
Wow.
Let's jump to the surgery day, August 24th. How does all this intense preparation and mapping finally play out?
It starts with a very difficult boundary setting, actually. Phil drives her to the hospital, but he doesn't stay. Because of his own fragile health challenges, sitting in a high-stress waiting room for hours just wasn't a viable option.
Which means she walks through those hospital doors alone.
She did.
But she writes that knowing he was safe at home waiting for her call acted as her anchor. It was his quiet strength that she carried into the pre-op room. And he visited later with her stepson, which she said was like a breath of fresh air.
Yeah. And the surgery itself becomes the ultimate validation of her choice, a preparation. The medical team had blocked out over 2 hours for the procedure, But because her body was prepped, her blood pressure was managed, and the surgical environment was optimized, it took an hour and a half.
A massive success. They successfully complete the hysterectomy. She deals with some complex reactions to the anesthesia afterward, spending time in the high-risk and respiratory units, but she pushes through. And then, on September 8th, she gets the declaration every patient dreams of from Dr. Gibb. She is officially cancer-free.
The thief hadn't touched the ovaries.
Incredible. But the crucial lesson Cricket leaves us with is that self-advocacy does not retire the moment you hear the words cancer-free. The system still operates on defaults, because on September 14th, she writes about the hardest lesson learning to stop and listen to her body.
Right, because case in point, her future oncology appointments. As she continues to heal, she writes about preparing to challenge the standard operating procedure. She anticipates the oncologist might push for precautionary chemotherapy. And she has done the research, evaluated her specific pathology report, and is preparing to negotiate for rigorous, regular blood work monitoring instead. She is operating as an equal partner in her health, not a subordinate.
She really understands the blueprint now. But we should definitely emphasize that this level of empowerment doesn't erase the deep emotional scars of the process.
Oh, definitely not.
You pointed out a journal entry she wrote on July 1st, the very day she found out the cancer was confined. It was supposed to be a day of pure celebration. But amidst the relief of knowing the cure would be a full hysterectomy, she documented a profound, quiet terror. She was afraid of how losing those organs would alter her identity as a woman.
She articulated a very common, yet rarely discussed internal conflict. That tension between being desperately grateful for a physical cure while simultaneously mourning the loss of a biological marker of womanhood. She worried how Phil would perceive her post-surgery.
The fear that surviving would cost her the way her partner looked at her, it just anchors all the medical jargon in something deeply human. The emotional toll is just as heavy as the physical one. And that vulnerability is exactly why her own medical team urged her to share this raw, unpolished story, including her tears and video blogs. They saw a patient who didn't just survive their treatments, but who fundamentally understood how to navigate their world without losing her humanity to inspire others.
They recognize that the medical field creates that forest of questions. They need voices like hers to help future patients find their way through it.
And that is the core value of When Life Changed and I Fought Back. Which brings us to the ultimate question for whoever is listening right now. Life is incredibly adept at changing the narrative without your permission. It might be a medical crisis, it might be an unexpected career pivot, or a sudden personal challenge. When the chaos feels like a tidal wave, what is your default? Are you a choice B person waiting for the system to process you? Or are you willing to take on the exhaustion of choice A? And if you choose A, who is your outside voice? Like, who can you call right now who will look at the blueprint without panicking?
Establishing those systems before the crisis arrives is the best defense against cognitive overload.
Exactly. So here's a final thought to mull over or explore on your own. Whether you are dealing with a crisis or just driving to work right now, Cricket had to build her family's medical map from scratch because her adoption meant she had no genetic history. But think about your own family. Even if you aren't adopted, how much do you actually know about your own family's medical history? Do you know what kind of heart disease or cancer runs in your family? Or are you just passively hoping for the best? Are you actively asking your parents the uncomfortable health questions today, writing down the answers, and building your own map? Because if you don't do it now, your loved ones might find themselves lost in a forest of questions when it is finally their turn to navigate the woods. Better to hand them a map now than leave them in the dark later. Thanks for exploring the deep dive with us.